Hi everybody, I want to welcome you to our Friday night meeting on Paul Holmes' Time for Real Change. Paul Holmes is one of the candidates for General Secretary in the UNISON election for a new leader, and I think that those of us who are in the meeting tonight, those who are going to speak, are people who desperately believe that UNISON needs to change in the way it organises, changes in the way it campaigns, changes in the way it stands up for its members and for working class people generally. And I think that what we want to do tonight, this is a series of 10 meetings that we've had. This is the last one. It's on a Friday, so I'm incredibly impressed that you're coming on a Friday evening to a meeting to listen to what he has to say. This is a meeting to look at UNISON and its actions around the health service, around its health members, around people in both the NHS and the private sector, and all the bits in between that exist in the health service nowadays, and to look at what we want to do about it. It should have been chaired by John McDonnell, who sends his apologies. He's been offered fantastic support to Paul over his campaign, and intends to carry on doing that. He's been at every single one of the other 9 meetings that we've had, but unfortunately there's a clash today and he's not going to be able to come, so he sends his apologies and wishes his best to us in that. We've got 4 speakers tonight who are going to speak for a short time, and then we've got questions that when you entered the meeting, when you signed up for it, you were asked questions. So we've got a number of different questions, generally on 2 big subjects, but we'll then ask questions, and it'll be up to the speakers to chip in and answer those questions as they see fit. And then we'll be looking at Paul summing up at the end, and we'll definitely be finishing by 7:30 because it is Friday night, and even though as health workers we often work Saturday and Sunday as well, we definitely want a Friday night for ourselves, a little bit of it ourselves. So thanks very much for coming. I think for those of us who work in the health service, you know, we've had years of privatisation, cuts, outsourcing, overworking, exhaustion, bursaries sort of going, all the things that we've had. And yet I think the last 8 months have been the most difficult in the whole of the time that I've worked in as a health worker. You look at the mess that the government have made over COVID and the pandemic, and the consequences that have had for us. You look at how many deaths we've had, one of the highest rates of deaths amongst health workers in the whole of the world, and disproportionately our black and BAME colleagues bearing the brunt of that, and dying in much larger numbers. You look at the faces of the people who've died, and it is just quite horrific to do. And I think people are not just exhausted, but they're also furious. And when we ended up saying, with the Rishi Sunak saying we'd had such a good 3-year pay deal that we didn't need anything extra this year, I think people were absolutely outraged. And that's why we've seen health workers across the country sort of, you know, come out and protest. Our problem is that really, why is that not being led by the biggest health service union, UNISON? Why is the fight on now, where you can't get a test anywhere for love nor money? Why are UNISON not calling us all out to protest and organise to demand that those tests are taken out of the hands of the private companies? And I just think we need a union that's going to start to stand up for us, that's going to make a difference in our lives, that's going to organise. That's what we want, and that's why I'm supporting Paul Holmes. I'm on the National Executive myself. I don't agree with most of what they do, and certainly on this I don't, although we got very close on the first round. Paul came joint first with one of the other candidates on the National Executive, but we had an elimination ballot, and that didn't end up winning, although the woman who didn't win an overall majority, which is interesting, that really the establishment continuity candidate isn't in a position where they can carry even half of the National Executive. I think reflects the level of disconcerting sort of unease that exists amongst so many UNISON members right across our union. I'm not going to say any more, because you probably haven't come to listen to me in large numbers. I'm going to ask Libby Nolan, who's from Swansea Bay UNISON branch, who is a health worker, nurse there, who's been really active over the last sort of 6 months, 8 months, over the pandemic and over pay, but is also on the health service executive. All of us are speaking in personal capacities, and so I'm going to have great pleasure in asking Libby to start us off. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you. Over the last few months, really, well, from March, we've seen health workers, and I'm speaking about health workers here as a nurse, under the most extreme conditions, working really hard, asked to put their lives on the line, and in some instances in my hospital, they have lost their lives. But not only that, to actually be separated from their families, all this, they thought they would end up at the end of it with a really good pay rise. If people cast their minds back, it was almost a promise. Yeah, you know, you do this and I'm sure they'll give us a pay rise. The conditions within the hospital, I wish I could take a video to show you, but the trust is now gone. I think the night that the news broke that we weren't included in any of the pay deals this year, or they weren't going to go early, I was contacted by at least 10 nurses who, some of them aren't even in unions. In fact, 3 of them weren't in a union. The next day I met with them, and one of them said that that night she sat down, and we're talking about really young health workers here who have never in their lives been on a picket line, who have never been interested in being active with politics or anything. And she said she burst out crying when she got home. She put her young babies to bed and started crying because she felt worthless after standing in PPE in an ITU, after leaving her own job, which was not that area, and going back, working really hard, talking about 10 to 12-hour days, sometimes not allowed to change your PPE. She absolutely believed that the government would give the pay rise, and not just a small incidental pay rise, that we would be compensated. Anyway, she cried all night, and then in the morning said to herself, I'm going to do something about this. So I came late to that action. None of the nurses I met, none of the health workers that were included in that had ever in their lives been involved in politics. The excitement in them was incredible. They arranged to have a meeting outside the hospital. They arranged badges to be made. They'd never done this before. The small bits of advice that I could give, but they were running away from us. You know, they were just incredible. When you take that back to UNISON and say, what are we going to do with that? And you get no response other than you can't have a march with our banners. We don't want you doing that because it's too dangerous because of COVID. You're talking to people, nurses, porters, domestics, receptionists who've had to go in every day, who haven't had the luxury of taking their laptops home like the managers that have been sending them in, and then say that it's too dangerous for them to march on the street. Well, it was laughable, really. So why am I supporting Paul? I'm supporting Paul because I know if that had happened and Paul was General Secretary, he'd get down and he'd be marching with us. He'd be making the posters for us, and he'd be engaging with the workers to encourage them to actually march. So that's why I'm supporting Paul, because I'm embarrassed, actually, and I was really embarrassed to actually turn around and say that nationally, UNISON are not supporting you. It's only the local branches that were. The excitement and passion that group, and it's grown and grown and grown. We're losing members. We're losing hope. If the union had actually encouraged and helped and led, we would have the pay deal by now. I've got no doubts about that at all. We also want a union that's going to join up all workers, so firefighters, teachers, all of us together, so that we become stronger and stronger. And I think Paul would do that. I think all of our struggles are the same. On pay, it's ridiculous that we're having to beg now after what we've all been through. I am embarrassed, and I don't want to be embarrassed anymore. I want a union that's fighting. I want a union that's not scared to go on the street, and I want action in the words that they say. Thank you, Karen.
That's brilliant, Libby. Thanks very much. That's an excellent introduction. I think you're absolutely right. I think we are fed up of a union that is too quick to tell us what we can't do. We can't march, we can't do this, we can't walk out, we can't do that, but not quick enough to tell us what we can do to fight when not just our rights, but actually our lives are on the line. And I do think that that needs to change. So absolutely, we need a union that's going to say what we can do and organise that, and actually put responsibility and the decision making back in the hands of ordinary UNISON members, not left in the hands in a small group of people who weren't facing the same things that you and other health workers have faced. So thanks very much for that, Libby. Our next speaker is Tony Wright. He's on the NEC, the National Executive Committee, in one of the Yorkshire seats, Yorkshire and Humberside. And I have great pleasure asking Tony to make the next contribution. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Karen. Just to say before I start, I'm not going to make any apologies for reading from a pre-prepared speech because I've got a terrible memory, and there's so many things I wanted to say in support of Paul that I thought it would be better if I wrote it down and read from it, so bear with me. As Karen says, my name's Tony Wright. I'm chair of South West Yorkshire Partnership Health Branch, which covers an area around Wakefield, Barnsley, Huddersfield, around that area. I also serve on the UNISON NEC in the male seat. And as Karen said at the start of the meeting, speaking in a personal capacity. I've known Paul Holmes for many years, and I'm very pleased to be giving him my full backing to be the next General Secretary of UNISON. My early memories of Paul are from when I first started attending regional UNISON meetings around 13 years ago. Right from the start, Paul stood out from the crowd as someone who was never afraid to challenge what we were being told if he didn't think it was right, and he's never stopped doing that. As well as the numerous battles fought and won in his own Kirklees branch, Paul would always be at the forefront of standing up for members, supporting them on picket lines wherever they're taking place, arguing for the members' position on regional councils and committees, the various committees he was on, and also, as some of you may have seen, at national conferences. UNISON members, locally, regionally, nationally, have always looked forward to Paul getting up and saying his bit. And that's because he talks sense. People know that when Paul gets up to speak, he always puts forward an informed, reasoned argument on behalf of the UNISON members he's lived his life representing. They also know that with that firm but fair approach, he'll never shy away from making the challenges that need to be made, whoever is challenging. For decades now, Paul Holmes has held employers and the union, importantly, to account on behalf of the members. And as UNISON General Secretary, he'll take exactly the same approach when he's dealing with people such as MPs, government ministers, and the leaders of our sister trade unions, who I might add, he will talk to, respect, and work in partnership with, not slag off whilst gloating about who's the biggest, who's got the most members. Though we'll see a totally different approach from Paul on that one, and that's what we need: solidarity between the unions. Speaking as someone who's worked in our NHS for over 26 years, with 20 years of those as a UNISON steward, I know that there's never been a more important time for UNISON to truly get behind its health sector members. We need strong, inspirational leadership now more than ever, and Paul Holmes will bring that. We need a General Secretary who will stand at the rostrum at the health conference, not claiming that a lower than inflation pay rise is a terrific victory for UNISON, but inspiring our members to have the confidence to go back to their branches and organise for action. We've had enough of going to UNISON health conferences and leaving disappointed, dejected, feeling we've got no hope for the future. We've done it for so many years. We don't want that anymore. There's too much to fight for. In the face of what is surely coming, where we are as a country and in the NHS, now more than ever before, we need a General Secretary who will tell our health sector members, you deserve much better than this, and I will help you get better than this. Well before any of us had even heard of COVID-19, you, our health sector members, were already battered, bruised and weary after years of short staffing due to recruitment and retention issues. COVID-19 has had a massive impact on your lives and the lives of your loved ones. Putting aside the risk to yourselves and your families, UNISON members working in hospitals, the community, GP practices, nursing homes, everywhere, have literally, as the previous speaker said, put their lives on the line day after day with unquestioning loyalty and commitment, and that must be rewarded. With millions of people clapping NHS staff in the streets every week, has there ever been a better time to tell the government our NHS members must have a better deal? UNISON should be leading the fight for a better deal, the one that we're being asked to back. Sorry, a better deal than the one we are being asked to back. And whilst we know it won't happen overnight, Paul will begin building to challenge for a better deal for health workers from the day he's elected, and he's made a firm commitment to that. In regards to the continuing privatisation of our NHS services, Paul will not just lead the fight against further privatisation of our NHS, he will also use his influence as General Secretary to begin discussions on services already privatised being brought back in-house. There are thousands, people don't know this, it's all done underhand, domestics, catering staff, admin, IT, all those other services that you, like me, know are vitally important, just as important as the doctors and nurses who are always mentioned in the media. They belong back in the NHS, and Paul will work hard to make sure that happens. As UNISON General Secretary, Paul Holmes will not sit in the ivory towers in UNISON headquarters in London. As well as being with members, excuse me, as well as being with members on picket lines and branch meetings, wherever he's invited, he'll be out there putting forward the arguments on behalf of you as a hard-working health sector member. Just as the leader of the largest trade union should be, he'll be there on television, in the newspapers, on the radio, where we haven't seen the UNISON leader for ever. He'll make you proud to be part of UNISON. Somebody's already said that they were ashamed, and I know what you mean by that, especially with the demos. Paul will make you proud to be in UNISON, and he's going to stand up for the members. So once again, I can't say it enough. I'm really pleased to be part of Paul's campaign. Thank you, Chair.
Brilliant, thanks very much. That's great, Tony. That was really, really good. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that sort of, you know, for far too long, UNISON has set its sights too low, and it's carrying on setting its sights too low. And I think, you know, when you talk about all the people who are now working for private contractors, but are working in the NHS and are still an essential part of that team, but are working in private contractors, that COVID has made 10 times worse, as the Tories, for ideological reasons, are insisting on getting people who are accountants to work out how to do testing and lab work and something in the middle of a pandemic. Is just nonsense, and it's an outrage. And we've got private contractor units that are supposed to be fighting for people's terms and conditions and for people to come back in-house that just aren't fulfilling that function. And I think the idea of looking that UNISON isn't working and we need to shift the resources back to where members are in the branches is exactly what we need to do. We have got another speaker, Jordan, but she's got children and she's got some childcare difficulties, so she is going to come on the line, but she's not going to speak until after Paul, or maybe after one or two of the questions. So I'm going to go straight to Paul. People may know him or may not know him, but Paul, I've worked alongside Paul for a long, long time. And one of the things that's absolutely true is that Paul has solidarity running through his very bones. And I do think that if there is injustice, if there are people who are exploited, if there are people who are wanting to fight for a better life, a better world, then Paul is always somebody who will be there for you. When I was disciplined and I was victimised by my employer, Paul was one of those people who, from the very beginning, what can I do for you? How can I help? And in a way, he and other people I work with, people in my branch, people around the country, were doing that. But UNISON, you almost feel like you've got to drag them screaming and kicking from a sort of the layers of officials in order to do that. And that's something that definitely has to change. So great pleasure in asking Paul now to make the next contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'll tell you a bit about my background, but then I'll talk about the health service. I first became a union activist. I've been a UNISON steward for 4 years. I've been a UNISON member for 4 years. I've been the branch secretary of one of the 10 biggest branches in the union for 31 years. I've been on the National Executive of the Union for 13 years, been elected 7 times, been in the National Pay Negotiation for local government. And I've been in branches where we've had members and represented those members in 5 of the 7 service groups. So I've represented members in local government, community and voluntary sector, universities, water, transport, and police. And what I'm really keen on is using my experience, because one of the things that were really interesting about Jeremy Corbyn and his support to become the leader of the Labour Party in 2016, 2017, were the number of young people that supported him. Now, the number of young people that supported him were people who you wouldn't normally acknowledge would be his base of support, a 66, 67-year-old man. But the one thing he'd got going for him, apart from his politics, was his record. You know, he could point to any point in history when he'd been in a Labour MP, whether it's the Iraq War or Nelson Mandela or the peace process in Northern Ireland. And he'd always been on the right side. So I became really active in the early 80s. There were, and perhaps the biggest, the miners' strike changed the way I think about, you know, nurses might think, how they've been treated about the pay offers or lack of pay offers during the coronavirus situation. But, you know, in the 1981, 1982, there were like jousting between the National Union of Mine Workers and the newly elected Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. And there were bits of strikes between 81 and 82. And there were jousting, there were arguments about pit closure programme. And that sort of burst onto the scene in 1984 with the miners' strike. But I took great cognizance of what Libby said tonight, because I remember the first week of the miners' strike. Now, however much the Tories had the Ridley plan and getting ready for that strike in 84-5, they were recruiting like mad between 81 and 84. And so there were hundreds of thousands of young miners. I once went on a picket line at Allen Bywater, and I couldn't believe at least 100 of the people were old enough to go down the pit. There must have been barely 16. And the atmosphere that Libby described as anger, this is the best way I can describe it to you. The strike broke out on a Monday or a Tuesday night, I can't remember which, but it was like Friday night in Wakefield. The atmosphere, excuse me, were absolutely electric. And people knew there were going to be a big battle, and they were up for that battle. But the difference was the leadership were up for that battle. And then you can turn the anger and the excitement into action. But what some people try to do is dampen it. And when there's a crisis, and there's no doubt there were an economic crisis before coronavirus, it's continued underneath the virus, and it will carry on after the virus. But it'll carry on with all the money that's been spent, wherever it's been spent, on furloughing, on private companies, on not using the public sector wherever possible. But they're going to come back big style for terms and conditions and pay, which is why they're making no offer. They can't make an offer which they're going to take away in 6 months' time. And an ordinary worker in the health service who goes to work, the pay is to go to work because it's hard work. And an ordinary worker in the health service will think, well, I've done my bit, I've worked hundreds of hours, I've worked extra. And I tell you what the mood is, I know 100% what the mood is. It's the same in the health service as it is in the society. We want to return to normal now. 6 months is the most you can work at a peak. You can't work like that all the time. It's not possible. And the health workers are knackered. They've been frightened. Some of them have died. And they wanted to go on holiday and they can't. And they've been exploited. They feel exploited now. That's why they're angry. Because, you know, everybody shows willing in times, particularly in the health service, in times where the pressure's on. But it's been completely exploited. And I remember once, and it's about leadership. What we should be giving is leadership. Now, I understand the mood, which is, oh, we don't want to rock the boat too much during this coronavirus crisis because it's like a national emergency. The first part of a national emergency is, oh, we need to pull together. But the immediate thing is that the Tories use Winston Churchill's quote, don't waste a good crisis. So immediately the Tories have, oh God, we don't have to tender for anything here. We can give stuff to people. We can give all sorts of, don't matter whether they can do it or not. Don't matter whether their experiences in accounting or audit, we can let them do that. Now the natural people to be involved in tracing and tracking, testing, would be the hospitals and the local government. And where that has been used, then it's been far more successful. But that doesn't fit the Tories' ideological stance. And it doesn't fit where the money goes. You know, there's this farce, isn't there, from racists, so we need to be patrolling boats in the English Channel to stop people coming into this country who want to get here. We can do with some boats patrolling the Atlantic Ocean, that's a metaphor this, for all the money that's leaving the government, our money that's leaving the government, and going to private companies and going over to the Cayman Islands and the Virgin Islands. That'd be a much better use of patrolling, because they're stealing our money from the banks. The other week, they announced that the bankers' bonuses in April this year for the previous 12 months was £40 billion. £40 billion. That's bigger than the budget for Scotland. That's far in excess of what it would take to pay a decent health service. But it's not going to health workers, but it is going to bankers. And anybody that's read this morning's paper, if you've seen the Financial Times this morning, which is not a common read for ordinary working people, Chris Grayling today, who was the transport, still MP, but was the transport minister, he was the minister, if you remember rightly, who chartered ferries for if there was no Brexit deal and that we needed to move stuff about. One of the ferry companies got £13.8 million and they didn't own a single sailing vessel. Well, today he's been appointed as an advisor to the Hutchison ports who run and operate among other things in Britain, the ports at Harwich, at Felixstowe and at London Thames Port. And he's been appointed at £100,000. And if you look in the financial register of the House of Commons, it's for a 7-hour week. That's on top of any work he's doing as an MP, and the rate of pay gets there. So, say if you're getting your calculators out, I'd let you know that that's at £285 an hour. £285 an hour when he's got time to fit them 7 hours a week in, when he's not representing his constituencies, which in my mind is a full-time job. So when nurses look at their pay packet, they ought to compare that to £275 for an hour for a second job. Most of our members who are doing second and third jobs to make ends meet in cleaning, we're lucky to be getting the minimum wage. But he's getting £275 an hour, and they're laughing all the way to the bank. Things have got to change. We've got to tell the truth about what's going on, and we don't whisper it and say to ministers. The days have gone when we say to ministers, oh, if they only knew what they were doing wrong and the impact on it, they'd do something different. They wouldn't. It's a complete and utter lie. They know what they're doing. It's like a Tory Prime Minister said in the 1890s, look, there's a class war going on, but there's only one side fighting. And that's what's happening at the moment. I went to a health demonstration in Leeds on the 8th of August, spoke at it from the shop floor as it was, just somebody present at the meeting. And I looked round and there's no union banners there. And there's no full-time officials there. But I saw loads of people who work in the health service, so in uniform, mainly young. And I saw one or two people I knew who were UNISON reps. So what's going on? Where's the officials? Where's the banners? Well, we've had an email saying we should be supporting this. It's not approved. And that's what's got to change in this union. Who not approves representing the anger of our members and the pay that they deserve? Who doesn't approve that? What committee needs to approve that? And it's a bit like the Black Lives Matter campaign. The members aren't stupid. If we're lukewarm in our support, if we're not encouraging people to send banners, if we're not sending senior full-time officials to speak at it, then we aren't wholeheartedly behind it. So part of my platform to be the General Secretary, first thing, number one thing, is that 50% of the money goes to the UNISON branches. So they can organise demonstrations, so they can buy banners, so they can get people for transport to go to these demonstrations. Most of the members would think, well, surely 50% goes there now. I think most members would think it would be more than 50%. Well, it's just less than 25% at the moment. For every £100,000 that a branch collects, they keep on average 25,000, and the national headquarters get £75,000. And yet everybody knows 90% of the work is in the branches. Anybody who goes to see a branch secretary, they're absolutely snowed under. And I say this at every meeting I'm at now. There's one word I want to get rubbed off the office wall of UNISON branch officers, is grind. It's a grind trying to represent people in private care homes where there's no disciplinary and grievance procedure. It's a grind trying to represent people in the voluntary sector where there's no collective bargaining procedure. We've got to change the union. We've got to go back to basics. However much we use new technology and IT and Zoom or whatever it is, they're tools. We need to use them. But the basic principles are the same. We should be outside these private care homes when it's safe to be so. We should be leafleting. We should be canvassing. We should be saying to local authorities, you shouldn't be sending money to care homes where they're not representing trade unions, recognising trade unions. The second part of the election process is, for me, I earn £32,000 a year as a legal officer with Kirkby's Council, and I stood for election every year. For the last 31 years, I've been re-elected every year. I have mandatory selection every 12 months, and I'm quite proud of that. somebody wants to sell against me, they can. But I earn 32,000, and I will do the general secretary's job on that wage. It's a wage that is sufficient for me. I'm not hair shirt, I'm not a saint, I'm not making a sacrifice. Hundreds of branch secretaries represent members on the basis of the wage, the terms and conditions of the people they represent. So I guarantee that £32,000 will be my salary, and the other 100,000, because the salary with benefits is about 138,000, will go back to the union to help demonstrations, to help welfare funds, to help strike funds. The third thing is you've got to be accountable. One of the reasons that some people think, oh, I don't have to support this demonstration, or I can sit on it, is actually they're not elected. So, you know, we've got this power base in the union now for people who work in the union. Nothing wrong with working in the union. A lot of people do a good job and would want to do a better job. And they deserve to be on proper terms and conditions negotiated by their union. But the 5 assistant regional secretaries, assistant national secretaries, and the 12 regional secretaries should be elected by the workforce. And they would get away from this thing that we don't want to profile. We've got this issue now that if we keep a low profile, even though we're a big union, that somehow we can collect the money and that it's some sort of Ebenezer Scrooge type situation where we can accumulate the money in the bank for a reason that's unclear for me. Because the only assets of the members, the only assets of the union is the members' terms and conditions, the members' pay and the members' pensions. That's the only assets we've got. Everything else is a resource to use to increase them assets. And so we need to get rid of the 2 big buildings that we own on Euston Road. It's probably worth £100 million between them. We need the assets. We need the union to be distributed across the country where the members can access them. And we need to get stuck in. We need to step forward. I keep telling you, the members are not stupid. When you go and see them, if I went to see a group of night workers tonight in a hospital, or the mechanics at Kirklees Council who were working on the evening shift maintaining vehicles, and they had a problem about pay or bullying or whatever the problem was, there's only 2 questions. This is our problem, Paul. My 2 questions are, what's your plan, and have I got confidence in you carrying it out? That are the only 2 questions. And we've got to change the union to give confidence. So like Karen referred to earlier, when some employers and some people in the union don't like our representatives, we've got their back. Whether it's if a health and safety rep says, we haven't got enough PPE, if a bin worker steward says, this vehicle's not fit to go out, then the union's got their back. When they say in the press or to management that I'm speaking on behalf of these members, they need to know that the General Secretary is saying they are speaking, don't touch our stewards. Now, this issue that's coming next, firing and rehiring, which is prevalent now, the threats of that in British Gas, in universities, Tower Hamlets Council, in putting out special purpose vehicles or having 2-tier workforce where people start at different rates of pay. They're just a different way of strangling the life out of the workforce. That's all they are. And you've got to win them disputes. Because if you win the first 10 disputes, you don't have the other disputes. Because they understand what the union's going to do. If you lose the first 10 disputes, you're in big trouble. Because they'll then come for the weaker branches. That was a spectacular victory at Bradford about putting work out. And the work that they want to power is always the work of the lower paid. It's always the work of cleaners, caretaking, catering, healthcare assistants, porters, etc. It's always, we need to extract some money from those who have got the least money because they think they're the weakest. And we've got to tell them that they're not the weakest. Now, I'm really clear on this, absolutely clear on this. The full resources of the union will go behind these disputes, but not just the resources. We will shout it from the rooftops. No more whispering about what we can and can't do. We haven't been, a representative of this union hasn't been on Question Time for 20 years. We've turned down numerous invites to be on it. That's where loads of people stop watching it now because nobody worthwhile's on it. But when Bob Crow is on, people switch on. When Bob Crow used to be on, people switch on. When Len McCluskey's on, when Mark Sawatka's on, because they want. Now, I want somebody on Question Time during coronavirus talking about how frightened our members are. and I'll refer to this later, saw an interview earlier this week with the chair of the BMA in his report to the conference of the BMA this week. And he said in a survey they'd done of doctors in hospitals, 12% of doctors considered in the first month that they got adequate PPE. If 12% of doctors think they've got adequate PPE, what PPE have they got in private care homes? And the situation is, we've kept quiet because we're trying to be reasonable, but we're not being treated reasonably. And every ordinary person understands if you've got a reasonable request and it's not being treated reasonable, you have to step up the gear. And that's what we need to do. We need to step up the gear to get the gear, and we need to be honest about what's going on. So let's start off in the basics, and I'll draw a remark to a conclusion now. That in 2006, hospital supplies in England were at 5 depots, NHS logistics. And them depots provided equipment, safety equipment, whatever, to hospitals. And it was privatised by a Labour government. It was privatised and given to the German delivery company, DHL, by a Labour government. We should have been in uproar about that issue, but we're slightly embarrassed when it's a Labour council or a Labour government. We shouldn't be embarrassed. They should be embarrassed. We should be taking, as an affiliated union, the policies of this union to the Labour Party conference. We should have a list of them. Number 1, no outsourcing. Number 2, no compulsory redundancies. Number 3, trade union recognition. Number 4, what we're going to renationalise. And number 5, what anti-trade union legislation we're going to get rid of. We were affiliated to the Labour Party, one of its biggest affiliates, from 1997 to 2010, 13 years of a Labour government. Not one sentence of any of Thatcher's anti-trade union legislation was ever removed. Not a codicil or a caveat or a sentence. If you're not doing that, you're not being serious. And when you're not being serious, the members understand that. In local government, we've settled for a terrible pay deal. Only one region went out there, really campaigned for a better offer, and they got a rejection. But the others didn't. And going back to the 2 questions that the members asked, what's your plan? How do you intend to achieve it? Our members didn't believe we intended to achieve anything on pay. They knew we were lukewarm. The members aren't stupid. That should be on the main door at UNISON headquarters. Never forget, the members aren't stupid. And the members deserve a leadership that's as clever, that's as wholehearted, and that's as committed as they are, and then they'll get treated properly. Thank you very much.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Paul. I don't think you can beat that. I feel a bit sorry for Jordan because Jordan's coming late, so I'm going to have to take her after Paul. So you're going to have to speak after that. Jordan's from the Homerton Hospital in London, and she's one of the UNISON, I think she's the branch chair there, and she's standing for the health service executive seat to try and get as part of the lay leadership to reflect more some of the anger that exists amongst health workers. So I'll ask Jordan if she'll come in now, and then we'll start with some of the questions. I do intend to finish at by 7:30, so don't worry, I'm not going to overrun. Jordan, thanks very much for coming.
Thank you. I really hope that my sound works okay.
Good.
Let me know if it isn't. So my name's Jordan Rivera. I'm an occupational therapist. I'm branch chair of my branch, Homerton Hospital in London. And I'm pleased to say that my UNISON branch nominated Paul for General Secretary on Wednesday. I just want to tell you about something that happened to me. I was working one weekend in the worst part of the pandemic in A&E, and a colleague that I know really well came in as a patient. I saw her name come up on the patient list on the computer. I've known her for years, and she's a massive extrovert and would be insulted if people didn't come and see her when she was in hospital. So I texted a physio colleague who was working to say, oh, look, Sophie's coming to hospital. Why not go and see her on the ward? you know, she'd really appreciate that. And I planned to go and visit her the day after, on Tuesday, when I got back to work after the Monday off. Well, unfortunately, on Monday, I got a phone call at home. He'd been to visit her, but she'd passed away already. And the Sunday during my shift, a popular nurse in his 50s had died in our ITU. And we were still shell-shocked from that. The ripples were felt throughout the whole hospital. And the impact of those 2 deaths within 2 days, that was very great on the wards. Now, I'm not telling that story because I want people to feel sorry for us, because some people on social media have apparently been saying health workers are expecting a pay rise just because their colleagues have died. And that's not what I'm arguing at all. I just want people to understand the environment that we were in at the time. We genuinely felt frightened for our lives. So that's exactly right what Paul was saying earlier. It felt like you just didn't know who was going to be next, and that we were putting our lives at risk every time we went into the bays on the ward. Every time we helped change a patient or helped them out of bed, people were frightened, and you could see the fear in their eyes. A nurse on one ward, as I was going around as a rep to talk to people about the lack of PPE, said to me, "Oh, this is how you can tell who's a real nurse and who's not a real nurse." Now, that comment, that really upset me, because it implies nurses should be expected to put their lives on the line. And our chief nurse even said as much as well. And this is so wrong. We shouldn't be expected to put our lives on the line. We're health workers, we're not soldiers. And even worse than that, to be expecting people to put their lives on the line for such poor pay. So when health workers found out that that other key workers were being given a pay rise but not them, we were just gobsmacked, and we were outraged, and there was like a real sense of disbelief and shock. And we felt like, hadn't Boris Johnson said that our service wouldn't be forgotten, that we, you know, what we'd been doing? And UNISON just should have acted much more quickly when this news broke, because there have been demonstrations all over the country organised without them before we heard anything from UNISON, and it felt like UNISON were out of touch. They should have been automatically speaking out against the lack of a pay rise, not waiting until a grassroots movement springs up without them. UNISON could have been leading that movement. Instead, we've got the lowest claim of all the unions, and we really are being heavily criticised online. We need a union that holds this government to account. This government is an incompetent joke. It's like a parody of heartless upper-class crooks. They don't care about the people living in this country, and they've let health workers down massively. They haven't given us the things that we need to work safely. There's been over 640 health workers dying, and they just make a profit. The profits of their friends are higher priority than our lives, and now they've left us out of the pay award, and health workers are just livid about this. Unfortunately, UNISON's not reflecting this. This could have been a time for a really big recruitment. I know recruitment figures are up, but it just feels like we could have cleaned up with this. And you know what else was really difficult? We felt like we could have been supported more about the PPE issue. This time was a terrible time for us in the hospitals working on the wards. We felt unsupported. Yes, UNISON did write to the government, but unfortunately, they did eventually start gathering stories on the ground about a lack of PPE. But we felt that the PPE being recommended wasn't enough. People were coughing and producing aerosols, and we were working in close contact with people. We were helping feed people, helping them sit up in bed. We were directly exposed to what they were coughing out, and we were only wearing flimsy surgical masks. I've never felt so abandoned in my life. Managers were just completely overwhelmed, and we were just being left to fight for things off our own back, and it felt like we were fighting for our members' lives. It really did. And it felt like we were fighting for our own lives. I'm so grateful to my fellow stewards in my branch. They were right behind me in this time. We did win concessions on the PPE in my hospital and got better guidelines for some situations, but we should have been better supported. We supported our local government branch as well when they were struggling to convince the council about universal PPE for carers. And of course, we want to support each other, and that's a good thing. But UNISON should have been providing the expertise and support on this. I was pleased to support Paul when we were choosing our nominations for General Secretary, and I could point to the times he supported health workers and the NHS when I was discussing our nomination with our fellow stewards. I was very pleased our branch decided to nominate him. I think it's very important we do all we can to change UNISON into the genuinely fighting union that it could be. There's so much that we'd be able to win across the country and within the health service. And that's the reason that I'm standing for the Service Group Executive, and that's the reason that I'm supporting Paul Holmes. So thank you for letting me speak.
That's brilliant, Jordan. That's amazing. Thanks. That's a really articulate description of what happens. And what's a shame is that you just don't get that from our union leaders as UNISON, representing sort of health workers and the experiences that they've gone through and the reasons why they deserve it. I've got a number of questions about pay, and they link to the notion that UNISON could have, when we were left out of that deal, that we could have campaigned and they could have thrown their weight behind it then, which would have made a huge difference. I've got one from Joe Lawson, who says, Nurses United are campaigning for a 15% pay increase. Would you support this? Alison Brown says, isn't UNISON's claim of £2,000 more equitable for low paid health workers? And Ben Jackson says, isn't that going to be difficult if some unions are calling for 15% and some are, like UNISON, are just calling for 2,000? How can we work together? So I'm going to take those questions on pay first. There's another question that Stephen Boston's asked, which is he works for a wholly owned subsidiary where they operate a two-tier system of pay, very common now in the health service in terms of the privatised and the wholly owned companies. Do you pledge to renationalise these subsidiaries? And if so, do you have any priority companies? So I don't know if anybody wants to come in on any of those questions about sort of what our claim should be. Do we support the 15% or the 2,000? What should our strategy be? And will it be difficult, and isn't a flat rate of £2,000 more equitable? Does anybody want to come in on those out of our speakers?
I'll start off if that's okay.
Okay, lovely. Thanks, Tony.
Just, I think these are classic tactics by the Tories. We've seen it before. It's divide and rule. It's a classic tactic. They tried it with the pensions, divide and rule, putting people on different tiers, and now we're seeing it. £2,000. It turns band twos against band sixes. We're seeing it in Scotland with the offer. They're trying to turn Scotland against England. I haven't spoken to Paul about this, but I think the main thing that comes to mind for me is we need to stick together. With the Gender for Change, we're all together, and that's what they don't like, because if we're all together, we've all got the same interests. We're all fighting for the same thing. So that's what comes to mind for me. We need to, don't let them divide us. We need to stick together. Thank you.
Brilliant, Tony. Anybody else want to come in?
Can I say something, Karen? Is that all right?
Yes, you can, Paul. That's great.
Yeah. I will speak. This is about backing up Tony really on the divide and rule. I spoke to some health workers who've been on strike earlier this year from Northern Ireland, and they were striking over parity with the English health workers. And I said, oh, so do you get that? Yes, and we're really pleased. We're really pleased. This is, and not particularly because we want to parity with Scottish workers who were paid more. And that's how you divide and rule. Now, my view, I don't want to be too arithmetic about the claim, but my understanding from the arithmetic is that if you were on any of the bands, top of any of the bands, 15% would be higher than 2,000, even if you're on the lower bands. Yeah. But the real, so it is more. But the real issue is, or the two real issues are, one, what are you going to do when the employer makes an offer? Which is the offer that's the key. You've got to be serious about the claim, because the claim is, if you be serious about the claim, you get a better offer. But A, what are you going to do when you get the offer? But B, and Karen will have heard this, and Tony will have heard this, I am fed up of hearing at every NEC meeting about our competitor unions, as though we're running the business. There are no competitor unions. If there are 15 unions in the health service, then the object of the exercise is to bring the workforce together to achieve a common aim. That's why it's called the joint trade unions. So it's the joint trade unions that win the battle. On the issue of outsourcing, you've to go, haven't you, to those who most want to come back the first. You have to discuss with the branches where the biggest battles will take place. The privatisation of the health service has gone on apace, forced by budget cuts, forced by the local hospital in Wakefield, if I remember rightly, the Yorkshire Health Trust, is repaying £2 million a month for PFI. Before they pay a single, buy a piece of equipment or pay somebody's wages, £2 million a month goes back to a finance company on the PFI contract. And they all need bringing back. Labour's got to commit themselves to that. We're just throwing money away. And I've used this at most meetings now. Big Bill Haywood, the miners leader in California in the 1920s, said every worker intrinsically understands that if a rich person's got $1 that they didn't earn, a poor person hasn't got that dollar and they did earn it. And that's just the same with outsourcing. The money's coming from the public to pay the health workers, and it's going to the Cayman Islands. It's the same principle. The principles are the same. They haven't changed.
Thanks, Paul. Libby or Jordan, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was gonna say about, it seems ridiculous that we're not going for 15% now. It's much more than the 2K. So whether you're a band 2 or whether you're a band 7, you're going to get, the band 2 is going to get more with the 15% than with the 2K. So it's not rocket science if it's money in your purse. The other thing I wanted to say is that whatever we do now, it's gonna be into the future, isn't it? We need to be joined with other unions. We need to be on the streets and marching and outside our hospitals and in our hospitals organising. It does matter what the deal is, but it also matters that we actually bring everyone together so that we're all fighting forward, not just for pay, but for the conditions in which we're all working at the moment. So that's all I was going to say, really. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Jordan, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah. I mean, in general, I do support a flat rate pay increase, but somebody said the other day that our pay has gone down so much that all of us have lost at least 15% of the value of our pay. All of us have, so it makes sense for all of us to get a 15% pay increase. And yeah, I do support it.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. I mean, Paul talked about what our offer is. Our offer is currently 0. Yeah. UNISON wrote saying, we would like you to reopen talks so that you get more than the 1.67% that you were promised 3 years ago. And the government have said no. They haven't even written back, just said, no, we're not doing it. And that's when people went sort of, so furious and so angry. And UNISON's response was, 8 weeks later, this week, they organised 2 days of action for which they gave us 1 week's notice. And I think that's the sort of difference between when you see what some of the unofficial spontaneous groups have managed to organise compared to what UNISON with all its money and its organisation can. There is a problem in our organisation. I've got one more question that's been asked, which is from Ben Jackson, saying, if you were General Secretary, Paul, would you be willing also to allow UNISON to become involved in Black Lives Matter? Because we've had some of those, you can't get involved in this, you can't, they're not an organisation to which we're affiliated. Even after the huge, enormous response from members and non-members, across the world, that people ended up going as individuals, not as UNISON collective. And I think that's been a real shame. I'm aware of the time. We've got 5 minutes to go. So I'm going to thank very, very much all the people who've spoken and all the people who've submitted questions. We haven't had time to take all of them. And I'm going to ask Paul to just come in for a last comment, maybe answer the question about Black Lives Matter, and then we'll let you go off to whatever you've got planned for your Friday evening, and carry on the campaign. Keep up with the website and the tweets that are going out. We've got a Facebook page, so keep in touch, keep organised, because we need to have the change that Paul represents. Paul.
Thank you, Chair. I'll start with the Black Lives Matters, really. And we had a dispute in Kirklees a couple of years ago on the bins, where there were bullying and racist harassment on the bins. 25% of the workforce were Afro-Caribbean, and the stuff I heard about were disgusting. I didn't know anything about it. Perhaps that's a criticism of me. But I was in an NEC meeting in London. I got a phone call from the council saying, "Will you condemn this action that's taken place, this unofficial action?" I said, "I don't even know what it is, but I'll be straight back and we'll talk." And I never condemned it at any stage. And when I spoke to the members of what had happened, I think they'd been very restrained, very restrained. Some of the racist incidents were horrific, and nobody particularly argued against them. There were plenty of witnesses for them. We had a 1-week strike where all the workforce came out, black and white. And then they said, "Well, we're coming out indefinitely." We sorted the dispute out. We got 2 managers removed, and the dispute was successfully won. But no black worker in Britain or in the United States is going to be surprised by what happened to George Floyd. Nothing at all, nobody at all. Because they know what happens, they know what the situation is. They've experienced that situation for large parts of their lives. The shock is for a lot of other people who didn't believe that happened. The fact that it was filmed, the fact that it broad daylight, the fact that it lasted for such an extended period of time, that nobody could make a story up about retaliation or suspicion or anything like that. And, you know, I read that we should have been at the front of the Black Lives Matter campaign. You know, in Kirklees, 13% of our members are black, ethnic minority. Some branches will have more, some branches will have less than that, depending on what area of the country we're in. But, you know, I read this situation. We should have been at the front of it, and our members should have seen us at the front of it. And I was reading this report this week by the chair of the BMA, and he moved on then from the experience of PPE to talk about why I think 34 doctors have died during the coronavirus, and something like 85% of them have been black and ethnic minority. And he said, well, it's younger doctors and how they're treated. He says 50% now of registrars in the last 2 years, new registrars, are immigrants. He said that our survey showed over the 4 or 5 months of the coronavirus that black doctors felt 3 times as much pressure to go into situations without adequate PPE than white doctors did. And that's the end result, whether it's George Floyd or the death rate of doctors, that's the end result of institutionalized racism. So we should be involved in Black Lives Matters, but like we should be involved in all sorts of things that's absolutely important to our members. Who would have said on the 1st of January 2020, if you ask people what would be the most important political issue that would probably happen this year, I think majority of people would have said something to do with Brexit, something to do with trade talks, or where we ended up. I'm not sure that the top 3, if you'd have done the survey, would have been Black Lives Matters, the A-level results, and coronavirus and health service pay. And we're in a moving situation now. It's changed. And what we've got to do is lift people's spirits, because it's like there's a thunderstorm coming. Everybody knows it's coming, but how do you protect yourself from it? Well, you don't protect yourself from it by hiding away from it.
One minute, Paul.
We've got to say to the employers and the government and those at the top of the trade union and Labour government who haven't got the confidence that we've got, and perhaps haven't got the material interest that we've got in representing our members. I am an ordinary member. I'm standing to be the General Secretary on an ordinary member. I don't like using this word because it sounds too macho, but I'm tough enough to put up with it because I know what's coming, absolutely know what's coming. Because those who own the wheels of industry in this country and exploit our members will ridicule and threaten and bully somebody who threatens to represent our members. But it bothers me not one iota, because I like the members and I am a member, and I want them and me to be on decent wages, decent conditions, decent job security, decent training in a decent job, and hopefully we'll get the week reduced to 4 days a week as well. So let's talk about aspirations and not what we're frightened of. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Paul. Thanks for everybody for coming.